on this on this afternoon. This is a platform that I'm used to. I've been teaching this way for several semesters, and we're actually face to face, but we've kind of had a hybrid mode for a variety of different reasons down here in Memphis, COVID and others. So I appreciate you all taking the time and coming out. And I also want to acknowledge for us here in Memphis, we are currently on the past Chickasaw land base. And I actually work closely with one of my colleagues who created another land acknowledgement with the Chickasaw. And I won't read that for you, but I just would like to acknowledge. And that is actually connected to the work or what I'm going to be talking about today, although I won't be specifically going into those indigenous landscapes and indigenous peoples within our particular landscape here, but they will be mentioned, and I'll bridge some connections as well. So let me just, I'm going to go here and share my screen. And I like to thank the MAS and Lindsay for inviting me onto this panel. I really appreciated that opportunity and coming in here. Yeah, I kind of, as I'm down here in the South, and so often, you know, some of my old, I would say New England based connections come out. So it was kind of nice to be able to talk and reconnect just regionally, although we will be coming up there for Christmas. So, okay, let's see. So today I'm going to cover a little bit, which may not be, it's not going to be tremendously it's archaeological based, but this is a very interdisciplinary and intersectional based analysis. And this is really how I go about my most recent research. I used to actually engage, or still do, initially had done my dissertation work with the Mashantucket Pequot up in Connecticut. That's up for me, or up in those areas. And when I came down to Memphis about 10 years ago, I was heavily involved in doing archaeobotanical analysis on archaeological sites, and got a lot of questions from my students, though, around the underpinnings of archaeology. And yes, in recognizing the historical narratives and the role of archaeology in our larger understandings, or global understandings. But a lot of them wanted me to try to push forward in terms of how, say, the past connects to the present. And I will say that this is something that helps my students at Rhodes have really helped me to think about how archaeology is relevant in the 21st century. And I'm going to really give them that credit, because they have pushed me to really think about these elements. And this is really, I will say, where a lot of the work that I'm going to talk about shifts out of. So here's just a presentation roadmap. We're going to kind of start with defining food, double food there, food inequality and food insecurity. And then I'm going to talk about why tracing the history of food inequality and insecurity matters. Then quickly, I'm going to just dive into the case study itself of Memphis, plantation geographies and the historical background. And then I'm going to go through this kind of intersectional analysis and all the different research methods that we've been using really in the last 10 years. And then I just highlight in terms of the kind of, I call them the 3 Ps. They're actually based upon another anthropological individual from up north, but thinking about food insecurity and food inequality through the 3 Ps, people, plants, and policy. And I'm going to tie that into the work that we've been doing. And then also what we learned about those people, plants, and policy in Memphis. And those can certainly, they also can be applied on the both regional and also national scene as well. And then lastly, I'm going to go into what's next for us. We have some really cool research that we're diving into with a bunch of other institutions and also nonprofit organizations, these intersections of food insecurity, climate, history, and anthropology. So I'll get us going today. Now, when we think about food inequality, and I just want to recognize, and this is where I am approaching this presentation, or even I approach our research really through a systems-based analysis of trying to understand, although like we do get to the individual base and we look at agency and people's choice and things like that, but most predominantly, we are really interested in understanding how the systems have changed from past to present. Memphis is at a crux right now. Like, we are actually known as the most hungriest yet most obese city in the United States. So we have this like weird paradox when it comes to both, I would say, obesity and then hunger dynamics. But so when I first arrived here, and I'll just give you an anecdotal story, I came from actually UMass Amherst area, and I showed up and I was like, wow, I'm going to be going down to the Mississippi River, right? So Memphis is on the Mississippi. There's got to be like loads of, there's going to be organic farms. There's going to be loads of farming and like lots of fresh fruits and vegetables down here. I had come from UMass Amherst, where I always just tell someone, like, you could throw a nickel or a dime or whatever, and you can almost hit an organic farm. I mean, there's lots of farming, and I would say local farming going on within these spaces and places. So when I arrived here, unbeknownst to me, I was like, wow, actually, there is just like tons of commodity farming happening within this particular space. And I'm going to give you some statistics here in a little bit. But this is where I want you to kind of recognize the problem itself as it's emerging within our particular space in Memphis, and also the broader region of what we call the Mid-South region as well. But when we're attempting to define food inequality, we're looking at these kind of systems-based elements, from everything from climate to waste, and then how that also ties to patterns of consumption. So I also really focus on production. We look at production, distribution, access, and consumption through the historical, or I should say through time and space. But when we think about defining food insecurity, I just wanted to kind of highlight some of these definitions, just in case people are like, well, what exactly is food insecurity? And if you are considered a food secure household, you basically have access to food at all times, and it helps you to maintain an active, healthy life. Now, these are definitions that are coming from the USDA, okay? So our US Department of Agriculture. If you are considered a food insecure household, you are uncertain, unable to acquire those foodstuff to actually meet your basic needs for all members of your household at some time during the year. And so here are just some of those primary drivers of food insecurity. And I also think, as the archaeologist or the historian, I'm always thinking about how this applies to the past. These also, have historical implications as well, okay? And I will say these are just some of the definitions of high food insecurity households having have high food security households having no problems, no anxiety, no issues, versus that very low food security household is that the eating patterns are disrupted and food intake reduced because the household lacked money or other income for sources, okay? One of the things that I want to recognize, and often does not get talked about within this larger narrative of food insecurity, is how this is actually a historical problem. And this is where the archaeology is going to come in. One of the things that I just want to note here is defining food security in the larger United States. And it's too bad I can't see the little, I don't think I could see the chat bar here. No, hold on a sec here. I was going to try to X out of that. Ugh. Hold on one second. Let me see if, I don't know why that did that. But let me play for my current slide here. Okay. So when we think about the United States, and if you notice here, there is this area of the South, which actually does not include Shelby County, which is that area just right here within our map, okay? But if you notice here, I just want you to keep noting here that's food security, which is along, in essence, the Delta region of the United States, it is 30% plus. These are farming communities that have high insecurity within their communities. This number has actually changed. When I recently, I took this image actually from 2017 and just recently updated it. And surprisingly enough, I will say that this number used to be about 21%. I will say that this has probably changed with the pandemic happening. And I will also say these numbers are actually post-Obama era numbers. And this has heavy implications because actually Obama also increased SNAP EBT for individuals during this time. So it'll be interesting to see when they come out with the more recent numbers in the last couple of years and seeing how that's changed. But you can see it's still a high percentage of our population are actually food insecure. So now you have a sense of that kind of food inequality or food equality and also food insecurity. But one of the things that I just want to recognize is why the history matters. And this is where I will say is kind of connecting the past to the present. So our goal within this, and I mentioned that my students were always kind of pushing me to create, when we think about our modern day landscape, they were like, yeah, the history is great, Dr. Kasper, but like, what are we going to do about it? Like we see a lot of these issues. We're one of the most hungry and also the most obese cities. What are we going to do about this? Or what can we as a community do about this? And so our project is actually originating out of the students' wants to participate and also co-create community-based solutions that would hopefully help some of these issues that I'm going to talk about here in a minute here within Memphis. So on the left-hand side, you see kind of that historical component. And then on the right-hand side, you see here what we've been doing. And this is tied to some of our initiatives, excuse me, our Food Advisory Council. The OPCFM is actually the farmers market that we created, our community-based farmers market, and then also even our heritage garden that we have here on campus as well. So what I'm going to do here is the case study itself is highly focused on Memphis, but it really is the intersections between these two counties, Shelby County and Fayette County in Western Tennessee. And what I want to just highlight here, I'm a very visual person. As I teach, I'm always trying to be visual, but I just want to play this clip. This is actually coming out of The Guardian. And we're just going to watch 2 or 3 minutes, but it just gives you the visual landscape of Memphis and maybe some of and I will say not maybe, the contemporary problems that we have tied to food on our current landscape. So I'm just going to watch this for 2 minutes here, 2-3 minutes.
Right now, there are 23.5 million Americans who live in what we call food deserts.
We wanted to come up with priorities. What were the needs in the larger South Memphis area? And one thing that came up over and over again was access to food.
You can easily get to a McDonald's and there's food on every block. It's just not high quality food. We blame the individual for so long, and it's not the individual's fault.
There's a lot of money in Memphis, and there's a lot of poverty. You know, we have parts of South Memphis where whole streets and blocks are just vacant. It's like a war that people left due to some catastrophe, but it was just white flight and sprawl. And so what used to be a small family-owned grocery store is now a vacant building, and on one end of it, they have a liquor store that's typical of South and North Memphis. Nobody is going to be attracted in terms of grocery stores, retail, to an area that is sparsely populated, and looks and feels dangerous. So a food desert, by basic definition, is a place where the majority of residents don't have access to what we call a supermarket, and a large percentage of the residents don't have transportation. From our office in South Memphis, our closest supermarkets are 2.3 miles and 2.5 miles away, respectively, and 1/3 of our residents don't have access to an automobile. My name is
Okay, so I just wanted you to visualize that element of Memphis and that dichotomy that exists between, I would say, the more wealthier parts versus our low-income parts. So there's this historical precedence, really, of individuals, I will say, communities of color that are within the Memphis area or our county that are predominantly low income versus those areas that have, and I'm just trying to do too many things at once here. And those areas that actually have a vast majority of wealth. And okay, there we go. So what I want to give you right now, though, is just some statistics to think about. And if you remember, actually, the that area where on the last map, and I showed you where it was food insecure in the United States. Now, this is another map that I just want to highlight. These percentages of farms and sales over 250,000. These are farms that are aggregates, right? They are owned by Monsanto, Cargill, all of the big ag entities. The percent of farms with sales that are below 10,000. Okay, so these are local farms. If you notice that this is a very small, like our region, really, we don't have farms that are smaller than, or they're mass producing, I should say, and don't produce less than 10,000. One of the, and maybe Lindsay can tell me this because I can't see the chat, but I always ask my students when I give this statistic. So regionally, in the 17 counties that are included in this on the left-hand side, we have about 4.5 million arable acres of land, all right, that is farmable. How many of those acres do you think are growing fresh fruits and vegetables? Not commodity crops. So commodity crops of wheat, cotton, corn, soy. They're not growing commodity crops. They're only growing fresh fruits and vegetables.
We have 25%, 2%.
Keep going lower than 2%. Can anyone give me a number? Of the 4.5 million arable acres, how many acres do you think are growing fresh fruits and vegetables?
We have 0.5%, but so what would that be? Oh God, I don't know. Like 500 acres? I don't.
0.05%. So less than 2,000 acres in our 17 counties are growing fresh fruits and vegetables. So this is like, I mean, when I heard that statistic, and we had actually worked with Harvard on a policy document. This is why we know this number, and they collected all this data. We were shocked. Okay, we were like, okay, this is a starting point. But how do we actually drum up or move past this massive landscape of commodity production? And I will say, we have this. The reason why we do have such a high density of commodity farming is due to cotton, right? we created this industry that was heavily tied to commodity farming as soon as Memphis was settled. One of the interesting dynamics that we run into is we were actually considered ground zero, I say, for Manifest Destiny. Andrew Jackson actually bought some of the first Memphis riverfront land along with two of his other, I believe one of his cousins, and he bought it for 5,000 acres for $500. All right. And then after that point, so this is when Memphis, even before Memphis was settled as a city, and this is in the early 1800s. All right. We have then the treaty tied to the Chickasaw in the early 1800s as well, that Andrew Jackson signs. And then he actually, in essence, takes that plot of land that he had, those 1,000 acres right on the Memphis riverfront, and he sells them almost immediately after the treaty is signed, and sells them for $5,000. So he makes a heavy profit along with his cousins and his other business partner. Now, Overton Park, John Overton is one of those individuals. You have Winchester Overton and Andrew Jackson. And this is where we see Memphis, like Memphis has this really unique history in the sense of where you have indigenous populations getting pushed out, but then also you have this, like I would say, immediate presence of capitalism emerging on the landscape, and then this thwarting of just the cotton industry. Many people don't know, but if you look at this map here, we have Memphis, and actually the equivalent of our cotton exchange was almost actually just as profitable and large as the New York Stock Exchange in the early in the late 1800s. So we had tons of money and capital that was flourishing, and I would say going through Memphis. But if you take note here, that kind of section also within this cotton production map that's located on your right-hand side, we were actually one of the, which includes Shelby County, the tail, I should say, the eastern end of Shelby County and Fayette County. We were actually considered one of the top 5 cotton producing regions in the United States during the US. So this is where I would say is Memphis has a story to tell. You often don't hear about it because we hear more sometimes tied to that, the Black Belt region that you see where those heavy areas of the black dots. So those are representing actually cotton bales. But this is where it's really problematic how the history of Memphis really hasn't come to the forefront. What I will say is that Memphis as well is considered a chocolate city, such as Atlanta or Detroit or Chicago. These may be considered chocolate cities because they have predominantly a majority city. So we have about 64% African Americans. So we also have this kind of rich heritage. I shouldn't say kind of, we have a rich heritage tied to both the rural components of our region, which are tied to the this production of cotton, and who was actually harvesting and participating in the production of that cotton, predominantly enslaved African and African Americans. But then also post-emancipation, you have individuals continually staying on this landscape, and then building, I will say, the economic, political, and social infrastructure of Memphis, and really bolstering those elements from post-emancipation onward. And this is where I think that Memphis has something to offer in terms of telling the story of food access and inequality. So as we pushed forward and trying to kind of understand, I should say, our landscape and what are the dynamics that creates this kind of past and present food inequality, we looked at 3 different kind of interdisciplinary methods. And we started with, I will say, or not started with, but these are all happening kind of at the same time throughout our projects, from the point of 2010 to, I guess it's been 11 years now, 2011 to 2021. We've participated in ethnography and documentary and archaeological materialities. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about each one of them. And I'm going to make sure, how much time do I have?
You have some time, don't worry.
Okay.
And
All
if,
right.
if people have to leave, we understand. Well, it'll be up on YouTube too. So
Okay. Sounds good. But in terms of our ethnography, and this is where, I mean, I am actually a trained archaeologist first and foremost, but I've really come to appreciate how ethnography can help us to understand not only what we're digging in the past and creating those cultural analogies, but also just in terms of interactions with individuals. And we've come to really like understand the history of Memphis, and also I will say that area around Fayette County and Ames Plantation where we actually excavate. But we've taken a variety of survey-based and also participant observation tied to the farmers market that we have actually run. And it started on our campus and then moved to actually what is called Overton Park, which is named after actually one of the founding fathers of Memphis. And it became actually the Overton Park Community Farmers Market. We were actually the #3 farmers market for SNAP EBT usage, so food stamp usage in the state of Tennessee when the market was run. We shut down right before COVID happened because we were reevaluating some of the elements of how we were engaging with the community. And it actually cost quite a bit of money. We had a USDA grant previously to run our market, and it cost about $50,000. I'm very open about these things because I think we need to learn from each other in terms of some of these dimensions, but it cost us about $50,000 a year to run our farmers market for the community. And this was something that we unfortunately weren't able to sustain itself. But we learned a lot and also gained, and I would say gathered a lot of data tied to those entities. But what we've also been engaged in and trying to understand, like what particularly is happening in these spaces and places in Memphis, is we've looked at the documentary data and tied to oral histories as well. We have looked at some of the WPA. Let me just go. I can't. My Mac computer is having a moment right now. But we looked at some of the slave narratives from the WPA from North Carolina and Tennessee. If you don't know, that actually Tennessee initially was an extension of Georgia and was just considered, or extension of North Carolina, excuse me, and succeeded then from North Carolina, was a land grant based landscape at the time, and then basically just cut off from North Carolina. And so we have a lot of connections to, I should say, the farming and also slave-based dynamics that are tied to that particular state. But what we've also come to really utilize are the census records within the area in which we study in the ruralscape, which is tied to an 18,500 acre modern land base. And it's known as actually Ames Plantation or Ames, or the Ames land base today. And this is where we conduct predominantly the vast majority of our archaeological work. But in this landscape as well, we also work with descendant and local communities. And this is where I will say Memphis is unique, or Fayette County, in the sense is there is this generational continuity of individuals from the time of slavery into our present day landscape, and where we've been able to actually discuss with descendant community members of their family members being enslaved, or there being records tied to that. Typically we actually talk to a lot of people about using their family Bibles as kind of the lineage based, or using that to establish lineages. But this is where we have one individual in particular that we've worked closely with, the Fryer family, and Dwight Fryer, who his actually great-great-grandmother was enslaved on one of the archaeological sites that we've excavated. And we were able to trace that back and through. Dwight actually himself is and you can see here on the right-hand side, This is actually his family tree. Dwight considers himself a barbecue master, so he has been taught this in terms of some of the food elements, and food was always at the forefront of his family, which was actually, they were considered a poor family, but he said they never had a want for food because they were growing on their own during the 1900s and into the contemporary, where he himself has a special relationship with food through particularly barbecue culture. So this is something that we've also dived into. But in terms of the archaeological materialities, we predominantly focused on a couple of different, or two different house sites that reconstruct the African-American experience during the antebellum period. And this is where we've kind of used this as a bookend to attempt to understand what exactly is happening and how the slaves themselves were treated, and what types of foodstuffs they would have had access to, and then also what would have happened in this particular landscape from post-emancipation into the sharecropper period, into World War I, World War II, and moving forward into the present day. Although we're not excavating sites that are post-antebellum into the present day, we do have lots of historical documents that are tied to that are helping us to reconstruct those time periods. So we're using the archaeology, really, like I said, as that bookend to establish those these initial time periods, or the initial understanding of how food inequality emerged during these plantation geographies and plantation landscapes. So I'm going to get into the people, plants, and policy component here. Here are just some of the programs that we, through the integration of both the ethnography, the historical documents, and then also the archaeological work, we've been able to create these different types of programmatic entities that have happened through the last 10 years. Like I said, we've actually, the farmers market initially started on campus, and then it shifted into a more community-based space in one of our larger parks, or what is the Central Park of Memphis. But we've done a lot of other elements. We have a heritage garden on our campus. We also have community-based archaeology days where descendant communities members are coming to speak to the public as well about their own experiences, both their familial experience, but also what it meant for them to live and grow up within these particular spaces. We also work heavily with the community, not within the classroom as well, but also outside the walls of Rhodes. And we create infographics to help bolster some of the programs that these entities are doing. And then most recently, we've actually been tied to, or we just created this new podcast series called, it's our Just Food podcast series. I'm actually teaching a course right now, which has helped to highlight the historical dimensions of this landscape, but also really giving awareness, or creating awareness around the contemporary programs and possible solutions for our particular issues tied to obesity and also hunger here within Memphis. So what we learned, and this, like, I'm going to kind of sum it up here in a couple of minutes. And I would say is about went through these elements of both the ethnography, the historical documents, and also the archaeological data. So this is kind of I was like thinking about to myself, how do I pull this stuff together and thread it all together? And this is important. I mean, I think these are the challenges to actually doing or engaging in interdisciplinary work. But I will say is we've come out with these kind of three dimensions of the people component, where we've recognized that there is, unfortunately, this false urban rural dichotomy, where they've kind of come, we often think about rural individuals very different than the urban individuals. But here, what we have in our particular region is that they're so interconnected. There's networks that are created between Memphis and the surrounding counties. And it's really this false urban rural dichotomy, and where the urban influences the rural and the rural influences the urban. And this is particularly tied within the food systems as well. We also see food as a unifier, but also a divider. One of the interesting things I will say is that Memphis is like, we're known for our barbecue often. And when you have like thinking about eating a more plant-based diet or promoting a plant-based diet, there can be sometimes some divisions that emerge. But I will say there's also racial divisions. I actually just recently published an article within a book called Black Food Matters. It was published in 2020 in the fall. And I talked about this, though, how barbecue is really one of our first racialized cuisines, and it's often not affiliated with plantation landscapes where it emerged out of, what our modern day barbecue emerged out of, really these plantation geographies. And what I will say is that individuals here in Memphis, some of the, and this is just like one nugget out of that, but most of the individuals that have benefited and profited from barbecue are actually not African Americans. Rendezvous, which is maybe some of you have visited Memphis, that's one of the famous barbecue restaurants. It's owned by a Greek gentleman. Top's Barbecue was owned by two and bought by two Jewish men. So it's interesting how these dynamics can kind of play out and how it can often be seen, food can be a divider. But one of the things, though, we often have the lack of historical perspectives that are noted in terms of trying to understand and promote solutions within our landscape. And I will say that there's often a lack of inclusivity in the local food movement, including food justice-based work here in Memphis, where you have a lot of white individuals such as myself running these large nonprofits that are attempting to engage and also provide solutions for obesity, for our food insecurity issues. We need to be a lot more inclusive around that work. In terms of the plants component, just talking about the species and the plants themselves, the commodity crops are really shaping our physical and cultural landscapes. And I know some of you may have seen, there was an image going around about like how even like the soils of what we know as that black belt, right? The black soils that exist are really heavily tied to even the voting component, or how people are voting in Democratic versus Republican-based components. And that's a little bit more of environmental determinist for me, but there, I will say, is that we don't understand, and we're starting to understand how even the crops themselves that we've planted within this space are then created oppression, but also creating inequalities through time and space. And then also indigenous crops are important to our region. One of the most recent things that I've been talking about, or people have been kind of talking about in Memphis particularly, is that like Memphis could be the new California because we have a lot of water. And this is where I will say is, yeah, we can plant maybe some of those Mediterranean crops, but let's really focus on, if we are going to shift, moving away from planting those commodity crops and thinking about plants that would have been indigenous to our region, which also would be, and vegetables that would be indigenous to this area as well. And that's important. And then lastly here, when it comes to policy, I will say that it needs to be local. And this is really the most important piece. One of the things when it comes to understanding policy, and this is what we're diving into more recently, is attempting to understand even how policy from post-emancipation onward shaped our own agricultural practices within the USDA, which then had implications for lending, who had access to certain farmlands, all of these different dimensions. And so policy really does have a huge significant impact, both on the local scale, but also regionally and nationally. And then it can change. And this is one of the things when we think about, say, the US Farm Bill, and people say that's a beast of a bill, but it can change both on the local, regional. It's hard to do that, but it can be done. So what's next? One of the things here that we're actually attempting to do is, now we've had about 10 years of really pulling together a variety of different data sets. And what we're interested in right now is trying to the intersections that exist between food insecurity, climate, history, and anthropology. And it should even read maybe agriculture, climate, and history and anthropology. We're going to be working more recently with folks from University of Mississippi, from actually, hopefully the Hermitage, also University of Memphis, and those that are regionally. And we're going to be actually creating one of the first urban-based climatic signatures based upon the trees that we have in our Overton Park. We're going to be doing some dendrochronological work, but we're also going to be, I talked about this interdisciplinary approach within this, this talk today. We're going to be still utilizing those historical documents, but in essence, what we are going to be diving into is one of the first examples of environmental racism, and then demonstrating how that, as tied to agriculture during slavery and then post-emancipation, and how that those laws, policies, and I should say social interactions then potentially shape even policy through time and space into the contemporary. I will say that even recently, just 3-4 years ago, the Black Farmers Association here in Memphis actually sued a large ag industry because they provided them with crappy seeds that would not sprout, and they won. So people often don't think that racism still exists, or these kind of dimensions of oppression and systemic racism within our systems, but they're currently happening and also have these deep historical roots within our region and also on the national scale as well. So I'm just going to end on here. Important takeaway is that we can tackle, though, I don't want to be the Debbie Downer here, but to recognize kind of these historical elements, but we can tackle this food insecurity and food security together if we look at all of these different realms to and just providing. I will say, as you may ask, well, what can I do, right? And this is where I will say is if you somehow can get involved in one of these kind of bubbles, right, and getting involved through, say, your local food movement, your food justice elements, hopefully we can actually change some of the systems to actually be less oppressive, and also creating more equity-based initiatives and functions versus then just perpetuating what we continually see in the modern day landscape. So I'm going to leave it there. I know that was a lot of a handful there to digest, but for those of you, I just love to take any questions that you may have. And if you have any questions at all further on to this, you can always send me an email at that email right there. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you. That was awesome. So yeah, if you have questions, you can either type it into the chat or in the Q&A function. To kind of get it started, are other archaeologists in other sort of cities that are comparative to Memphis sort of following what you're doing, or were you following what they're doing, or are you like the only one sort of doing this, like this sort of taking the historical, you know, context and then kind of looking at how it's impacting today in the inequality?
In terms of food base, I would say there's very few folks that are. I think Amanda Logan may be doing something similar, but like in Africa. But it's interesting. We're actually going to be on a SHA panel together, and I was like, oh, I'll get to hear, because she actually, her title of her talk is like food justice and archaeobotany, right? So I am an archaeobotanist, and this is where, like, thinking about how we can apply this. I don't know of anyone within the US that is currently doing this.
Yeah, because we typically think of it, that's a problem out there, right? Not like looking at us and everything. Another question is, are your students in the class, when they learn about, you know, the connections between when they're looking at the stuff historically and what's going on, and they, you know, like you said, they're like looking around at like, hey, this seems very familiar. Are they shocked that it seems very familiar, or are they just kind of like, yeah, here we go again, it's coming around? What is their reaction when they learn about the history?
Well, so a lot of the time, so Memphis, Rhodes is typically like, we have a lot of Southern-based students, but we do have students from California. And I will say that since I've been here at Rhodes, I've had over 600 students run through my archaeological field school. Okay, so it's an F7, so it's a science foundation. So the students will take it just because they're like, woohoo, I can get my science by, you know, as they should, like hands-on approach here, right? They are often, there is a little bit of a shock, but they're often grateful that they have learned, like, right, so, oh wow, like if what I'm consuming has this kind of historical based narrative, right, and understanding and being able to make choices. Like right now I'm teaching a class that's predominantly around food justice, and the students are just continually like having an aha moment and being like, how did we not know this? How do we not know that, you know, even today our farm workers aren't paid enough, you know, they're paid very minimal, right? And this is where it's like how that's tied even to our slave-based system as well. So they're starting, I think they appreciate being able to make those historical connections and then promoting those as well.
Yeah, I had to ask that one only because it was for me a dual thing, because I lived in Hartford for a year, Hartford, Connecticut, which I believe up until last year maybe was a food desert. It still might be. And when I lived there, it was like, wait, what do you mean there's no grocery store, right? Like, what? Like, I didn't even comprehend that that could be a thing in a city that big, right? Kind of stuff. So we have a question from Randolph Powers. How did your archaeological findings influence your conclusions?
So I will say that when it comes to the archaeology, and let me just go back, we predominantly, and we can excavate, or we're able to excavate really around like barbecue, and like some of those elements have come together. And I will say that our houses themselves, so we've established that many times that they are actually potentially cooking in communal entities together. All right, so those that were enslaved both on the Fanny Dickens plantation, and then those that are were enslaved in the Cedar Grove. So Fanny Dickens actually had only about 38 enslaved individuals versus on the Cedar Grove plantation was over 200 people. We anticipate, like, this is where we have just been working on Cedar Grove for about 2 years now. And this is where the cross comparison is happening from this kind of mid to small base size plantation versus this very like a 5,000 acre plus plantation. And what we're seeing is that the processes are very similar, although I will say is we have a lot more, and I don't know the answer to this, and we're going to be exploring it, but we have a lot more storage vessels being found on the Cedar Grove plantation versus the Fanny Dickens one, where there would have been less slaves just potentially living in the 3 or 4 houses that we had excavated. And so this is where it's just kind of constructing what was the daily life of these individuals. We found tobacco pipes. We're actually doing some residue analysis of the tobacco pipes. So they weren't just I shouldn't say tobacco, because they were smoking other things, menthol, vanillin. We haven't found hallucinogenics. We're looking for the ginseng weed, but this is where it's just helping us to reconstruct the daily lives of these individuals, and I will say establishing that that what was occurring during those time periods, then to be able to kind of build off in what changed potentially during post-emancipation or even into the sharecropper period.
I'd muted myself. So we have a couple more questions. So what part does theft or looting have in determining supermarket locations?
It does, and it's awful. So this is something I didn't, I've mentioned this in other lectures, but a policy dimension where, and some people don't recognize it, but we have Kroger as like the big supermarket down here. And they actually will put into their in their leases, or when they sign a lease with, like, say, whatever entity they may be leasing the property from, or leasing the storefront from, but they say that no other supermarket can go within that spot within 10 years. And this, it's a weird, it's like a non-compete clause. And so they've done that to protect themselves, just in case they don't want to move out. But so we recently had actually a supermarket leave, actually, South Memphis, and it was a big deal because it was already a food desert, and the community members were extremely upset about it, as they should be. And one of the reasons they cited was that there was a lot of theft. They could not contain the theft that was happening. But then I have to ask myself, why are they stealing? Well, if you're stealing in a supermarket, right, it's like and this is where Maine, up where you all are, where, Maine just declared as a right to food state, or they're trying to pass this. And I think that this idea is really interesting. I was actually asking my students yesterday, do you think Tennessee could ever do that? And a lot of them said, it's a great idea, but I don't think it'll happen. But I do think that if there's ways in which we need to structurally address, it's not just that people are stealing, but ask the question why they are stealing. And then, there's these larger issues of intersectionality and issues of social and economic reasons, which lead us to maybe why supermarkets are pulling out. And we need to help, I would say, to address those issues in order for supermarkets to stay put, and even give them incentives to stay put. That can happen as well.
No, that's a very good point. The incentives is key. Well, that is what we had time for today. So thank you to our viewers for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at our next lecture, our last one for the season, which is Wednesday, December 15th, when we are going to be joined by Dr. April Bisa, who will be discussing the archaeology of protest. And again, we rely on supportive viewers like you, so consider becoming a member of the Massachusetts Archaeological Society. So again, thank you, Dr. Kasper. We're getting a lot of great presentations and thank yous in the chat, so and everything. So have a wonderful Wednesday, everyone. Talk to you guys soon.
Thank you.